Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Annie-Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today we're going to take an exciting look at the women's revolution in Iran that is working to take down the Islamic Republic.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
This is the end of the Islamic regime of Iran. This women's revolution is going to bring the Islamic regime of Iran to its knees. And it will liberate not just Iran, not just Afghanistan and the Middle East, not just Iraq, but the entire world. This women's revolution is your revolution.
I'm Annie-Laurie Gaylor, and that's a sneak preview of today's guest, international activist, atheist, feminist, and secularist Maryam Namazie, who is leading protests against Iran in the UK and EU. Maryam Namazie fled Iran with her family when the Islamic Republic took over her country and has dedicated her life to working with immigrants, to free women, and for secular government, working with the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, which campaigns to end apostasy and blasphemy laws, defend secularism and universal rights and equality. She is host of the long-running weekly Bread and Roses TV show, produced in both English and Persian. Maryam Namazie has received many awards and recognitions for her activism, including FFRF's first Henry Zumach Freedom from Religious Fundamentalism Award in 2017. Welcome back to Freethought Matters, Maryam.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure always.
So before we talk about the situation in Iran now, could we first talk about your personal connection to Iran? You were born there, and what is your personal story?
Well, I guess, yes, I was born there, and after the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran, like millions of others, our family fled the country and were refugees for quite a while until we were able to settle down. So we went to India for 2 years. We weren't allowed to stay. Then we went to Britain. We weren't allowed to stay. And then we finally settled in the United States. And I moved back to Britain in 2000. So it was a long journey to find a home. And of course, the sort of the immigrant story, the refugee story of starting from scratch and building a life again without any of the normal support system that you would usually have, without your family, without all of your friends, and most difficult, of course, for the older generation. So for my parents, very, very difficult. For myself, I started university as I got to the US, and my sister was 10 years younger than me. So she went through the public school system. She's now a Yonkers public school teacher. She stayed in Yonkers where we settled. So it's the story of so many people. And of course, you do bring with you the battles that you fled from, because you feel like you have a responsibility to do something, given the fact that now you're not living in a theocracy anymore, and you have a responsibility to those you've left behind. So in a sense, my story is one of activism from right from the beginning in various areas, from refugee rights to women's rights and against Islamic fundamentalism and religious rules.
Can you remind me and the viewers what happened in the early days of Khomeini and the Islamic coup?
Well, in a sense, it's a good. I mean, it's interesting that you call it a coup because, in a sense, the Islamic movement stole the revolution. The revolution was against the Shah's dictatorship. It was not an Islamic revolution because, you know, when something is Islamic, its characteristics are Islamic. The demand for Sharia law, for example, the demand to veil women, the demand for keeping women segregated and as second-class citizens. It was very much a revolution for freedom and equality. And in fact, it was the Islamic movement that took this revolution, expropriated it, and killed lots and lots of people in order for this government to maintain power. What's interesting maybe for a lot of your viewers, and something that isn't very known, because as we all know, history is always written by the victors, is that it was Western governments, including the US government, that met in Guadeloupe and decided that they no longer wanted to support the Shah's regime, which was a Western-backed dictatorship, and that they preferred an Islamic regime in Iran, given the fact that the revolution was a left-leaning revolution. And it might seem absolutely absurd and bizarre when you hear that today, but we have to remember that this was during the Cold War, and the US and Western foreign policy was very much focused on creating an Islamic belt or a green belt around the Soviet Union at the time as a bulwark against communism. And so it actually fit in very well with US foreign policy at the time. We know, for example, that they trained the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And of course, now the Islamic movement stands on its own 2 feet. It is vying for political power and has power in many places. But at that time, it was really brought to center stage by Western governments. And
many of them had a genuine grievance against imperialism.
Well, I mean, I think you can find, if you look at the history of the Islamic regime of Iran too, you'll see that they did have private talks with the United States. There's the whole Contra and arms deal that was made many years ago. And I think in reality, anti-imperialism is a propaganda of the regime, but very much so one that it's based on. One of its pillars is anti-Americanism. But the reality is that they're not really anti-imperialist because the Islamic regime of Iran is itself an imperialist force in the region. It's involved in killing civilians in Syria. It's involved in killing civilians in Iraq. It's involved in Yemen. And it is very much, Islamism is a form of imperialism as well. So it's quite funny when there are some left groups, and I say this as someone on the left myself, that see Islamism as a anti-imperialist force, when in fact it is very much an imperialist one that is changing the characteristics and culture of people in that region. If you look at the lives of people living in countries across the Middle East, it was very different over 40 years ago. And also in the West, you know, if you look at certain Muslim majority neighborhoods here in Britain, there never used to be so many veiled women. There never used to be so many Islamist sort of mosques and centers. And that's all as a result of the rise of the Islamic movement.
So this may sound a bit naive to you, but to me it was looking like the theocracy in Iran had loosened up a bit over the years. And then last summer, it all exploded. What happened?
I think that's interesting that you said that, because that has been very much part of the Islamic regime of Iran's propaganda. The reality is, look, you cannot have a theocracy in the 21st century because everything that consists of 21st century life, it is at odds with, you know. And if you're looking at a country where the population is over 70% of the population is under the age of 30, anything that they want to do, from what they want to, how they want to dress, what they want to think, who they want to fall in love with. They want to dance. They want to listen to music, all the way to they have different political opinions and beliefs. They want to be atheists. All of that is at odds with an Islamic regime, and one that has basically 130 offenses that are punishable by death. Everything from sex outside of marriage, apostasy, heresy, blasphemy, being gay, having gay sex, and so on. So it has been an explosive situation in Iran for many years, and there have been ongoing and very widespread protests in Iran over these past 40 years. They've unfortunately all been suppressed. But I think one of the things that the Islamic sections of the Islamic regime felt was that in order to maintain the Islamic regime, they have to bring certain reforms in the country. And these were the people who were called reformists. But one of the things we need to be very clear about is that even the reformists wanted an Islamic state, and they were working within the Islamic system. And so obviously, if you have an allegiance to the Islamic State, and don't forget, even those who were called reformers had to be approved by the supreme spiritual leader, which is Khamenei, and they were only allowed to run if he and the Guardian Councils permitted it. So it was a way of trying to loosen the pressure off the regime by introducing the sort of reformist faction. What's interesting in these current protests is that, you know, you're dealing with Generation Z. They know exactly what they want. They are the first generation with portable digital media at their fingertips. They have social media footprints. They have access to the world. And they know that they cannot have the freedoms that they want under an Islamic regime. So there's no illusions to any aspect of the regime. The slogans are very clear. It's woman, life, freedom. You cannot have any of these under an Islamic regime. The slogans are very clearly against all of the Islamic regime. So the slogans are, we don't want an anti-woman regime. We don't want an Islamic state. And there's a lot of anti-clericalism and actually anti-Islamic backlash that you can see in these protests. And if you're interested, we can talk about those too, because I think that's something that's been highlighted much less. But it is something that we've been talking about for many decades now, that this anti-Islamic backlash is coming to stay. Islam is not going to survive as a political movement in that country because of what 40 years of Islamic rule has meant for the people there.
So, of course, these protests were brought about specifically by the terrible death of Mahsa Amini late last year. And when we come back, Mariam, I want to talk about the numbers of people who have been arrested and detained into the tens of thousands, and the death penalty executions that are starting and what can be done about that.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm talking with Maryam Namazie of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain about the protests in Iran and what can be done about it. And Maryam, there have been hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. I don't know what's going on now, but we hear talk of about 20,000 people arrested and detained, and now we have the parliament calling for the death penalty. We're starting to see executions. Do you have any inside track on what's going on there?
Yeah, well, as you say, over 500 people have been shot and killed, protesters. 70 of them are children, 18 and under. The youngest child to have been killed was 2. And there are quite a few teenagers who've been killed. 20,000 people have been arrested. And as you said, the Islamic Assembly has called for the execution of protesters. They've already executed 4 young men, and they threaten to execute many more. The only good thing of this is that there's still a lot of pressure, and some who were meant to be executed have not yet been executed. So we're hoping that we can keep pressure on to prevent more executions. If the regime could, they would carry out mass executions. They've done it in the past. They executed 5,000 people over the summer, in one summer in the 80s. It was called the Bloody Decade. And it's because of these protests that they haven't been able to do the same. And, that's a really important thing, I think, that people can do to support those in Iran.
Well, speaking of protests, we started with a clip of you at Trafalgar Square. What have you and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain been doing?
Yeah, so we've been trying to be involved, as well as with One Law for All, involved in weekly protests. Initially, it was daily protests, and now it's weekly protests in order to continue to highlight what's happening in Iran. A few days ago, we had a protest in front of UNICEF, and I actually got to meet with the deputy executive director there about the many children who've been killed and who have been arrested. And we are having a future protest. One is, it's called Body Riot. And there was actually a slogan on graffiti on one of the walls in Iran that said the Body Riots. And on the 1st of February, which is World Hijab Day, we plan to have a day where we go topless and in our bras to protest the veil and to defend the women's revolution in Iran. Another important day, which FFRF is involved with as well, is February 4th, which is the day that over 40 organizations, Freethought, atheist, ex-Muslim organizations that have come together to politically sponsor the atheist and ex-Muslim Sohail Arabi. On the 4th of February, we're having different actions in order to highlight his case. So we're going to be having a protest at Russell Square in London, and other groups will be having protests in various cities, but also lots of work being done on social media.
So you and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain have been trying to free an Iranian man, an atheist, Sohail Arabi. And he was arrested in his home, I think in January, and appears to have disappeared. Can you briefly tell us his story?
Yes, so Sohail Arabi is someone who was on death row in Iran for many years because of a social media post that was seen to be insulting to Islam's Prophet Muhammad. And because of protests, including by FFRF, he was eventually released, but he was in internal exile. And he has huge medical problems as a result of the tortures he faced during the over 8 years that he was in prison originally. So as a result of the protests in Iran and the mass arrests that the regime has been doing, they've also been arresting personalities that are well known, women's rights campaigners, and they also picked up Sohail Arabi. And the reason we didn't know where he was, we've later found out, is because he was beaten so badly when they arrested him that he had to be taken immediately to hospital. And he had to spend a few days in hospital before he was well enough for them to transfer him to Greater Tehran prison. He actually had a heart attack when they beat him so much during the arrest. And so he is in prison now. We've got reports that he's facing severe torture, and that the regime has plans to sentence him on more trumped-up charges. So it's very good that we have over 40 organizations, including FFRF, acting as political sponsors for his case, so that we can continue to highlight his case and make sure that we save his life. He is at risk, as are many of the political prisoners who are in prison now and facing really awful tortures. And also there's a lot of reports of women facing rape and sexual assault.
So we also saw the arrest of Iranian actress Tirana Al-Aladousti, and she, of course, appeared in the Oscar-winning Iranian film The Salesman. Now, she was recently released. Is any protester safe in Iran?
I mean, the reality is that even those who are released, they're often released on bail, and they could be picked up again and tried at a later date. What we are seeing, though, is that a lot of the protesters are being sentenced in courts that are taking only a few minutes, and they are being sentenced to long-term prison sentences. If you look at the 4 young men who were executed, from the time, it was only a couple of weeks to maybe a couple of months for some of them, from the time that they were arrested to the time that they were hanged. And so it's just this effort of the regime to try to kill as many people as it can in order to frighten people into silence and submission. But the reality is that it can't do that anymore. This generation that is fighting this regime is not going to back down, hasn't backed down. And with every person they kill, there are more and more people who come out on the streets who are coming to mourn those who've been killed. And there are several dates for mourning. So the 7th day after the person's been buried, the 40th day after the person's been buried, people gather at the memorial sites. And what's interesting is it's not the usual Shia mourning rituals that take place. There are women removing their veils and twirling them in the air, burning their veils, shouting "Woman, Life, Freedom," doing protest dances, and, you know, very much so kicking out clergymen. I mean, there are so many video footage of mourners telling clergymen to get the hell out of there. They're not wanted there. The mother of a 9-year-old who was killed, Kian Pirfalak, at the memorial, at his funeral, she said, "Don't anyone dare to read the Quran over my son's body. My son hated the Quran." You know, and you've got other cases like Mohsen Shekari. There's video footage of him by the Iranian regime on his way to be executed. He was blindfolded, and they asked him, "What's your final will and testament?" And he said, "My final will and testament is please don't cry, don't mourn over my death, don't pray, don't read the Quran, instead celebrate and sing joyous songs."
Mariam, you have stated categorically that Islam is not a religion of peace. Can you explain?
I think Islam is definitely not a religion of peace. To be frank, I don't think any religion is a religion of peace. We've even seen, you know, the Buddhist right in Myanmar and Sri Lanka attacking Muslims, for example, or the Hindu right doing the same in India. So I think all religion, particularly if it has access to political power, it is the opposite of peace. It is the end of peace, actually. It is the end of democratic politics, the end of free thought, and the end of women's rights. I think religion as a personal matter, you know, you have a right to it. I think religion is something that has no place in the 21st century, but I defend the right of people to believe in anything they want. That's very different from religion in political power. It's no longer about personal belief, but about suppression and control of a society, particularly via the suppression of women and using religion to do that. So I think really sometimes religions do seem peaceful, especially when they don't have political power, but just give them a little inch and they will take your whole arm off.
What is it like being a woman right now in Iran?
To be a woman is a crime. The fact that you're not born a male is a crime. And you can see that in the way that Islamic laws target women. They are obsessed with targeting and policing and controlling women. Everything from a woman's voice is banned. Women cannot travel or study or work without a male guardian's permission. Their testimony is worth half that of a man's. In a Sharia court, they have limited rights to divorce, child custody. Domestic violence is seen to be the prerogative of the man. So it is a situation where women have felt like it's a crime to be a woman. But today, it is these women and girls who are leading the women's revolution in Iran. They have many men by their side. And what has become clear for, I think, the society at large is that a measure of women's freedom is the measure of freedom in any society. And that's why women's rights is so key, and the liberation of women is so key here. And because it's a movement for women's liberation, it is targeting Islam, and it is targeting patriarchal rules and cultures. Of course, there's a long way to go, but I think it's the beginning of a really important challenge to the Islamic fundamentalism, not just in Iran, but across the globe.
You have spoken very powerfully about the absolute necessity of having a secular government to ensure that there are rights for women. Could you just elaborate briefly?
When religion has political power, they do come for women first, they target women first. And we're not just talking about Iran, where it is a theocracy, it is a real-life Handmaid's Tale and Gilead. But if we see the rise of, let's say, the religious right in the United States, suddenly they come after abortion rights. And it is a question of them always coming for women first. And, you know, as I said, people have a right to their beliefs, their religion, but when it's in the state, it's so detrimental. It's not only discriminatory, but it encourages and legally imposes violence against women and non-believers and everyone else. And that's why the separation of religion from the state is so key. It isn't it isn't a philosophical discussion. This is clearly and seriously a matter of life and death for those who are living in theocracies. Women die if there is a religious state.
Well, I'm going to say amen to that. Maryam Namazie, thank you so much for everything you're doing for human rights, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you to you as well for all your great work and for sponsoring Sohail Arabi. And he knows about it, and it has given him great strength, even though he is so strong already and so courageous. But thank you for FFRF support on his case too.
And to viewers of Freethought Matters, thank you for watching, because free thought matters.